The pool van. Or bladder 20. There are men who can find anything. Set them in a forest and they'll come back with a missing watch, a misplaced compass, and the bloke who lost both. Then there are Adam and Rupert. Adam and Rupert could not have found a goat in a phone box. They had a kind of negative talent for it, a sort of anti-bloodhound capacity, in which the act of looking actively repelled them from the thing being looked for. You could have stood in front of them holding a sign that said, "Here I am," and they'd have walked past asking each other if anyone had seen you recently. I know this because I tested the proposition more than once, and on the night I'm about to describe, they tested it on themselves without any help from me. A word about each of them, since they're going to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting in what follows. Adam was the kind of man whose radio batteries would be flat on exercise and who would explain at length why this was the signaler's fault. He was a decent enough soldier in the technical sense. He could run, he could shoot, he could carry his share of the kit. But every minor failure in his vicinity belonged to someone else by the time the debrief came round, and he had a particular gift for finding that someone else and making sure everybody knew. Rupert was a different problem. Rupert was loud where Adam was pinched, and the loudness was in service of an opinion of himself that nobody else had ever held about him. There was a night I'd lent the guard one of the McNab books to read on Stag, and Rupert came past, drunk, and decided he was having it. He took about 4 steps with the book under his arm before he went down face first into a puddle. The book went with him. I got it back muddy and slightly warped, and Rupert never apologised because Rupert had genuinely forgotten about it by the next morning, the way a dog forgets which hedge it pissed against. I still have the book. The cover is still slightly the wrong shape. It was the Isle of Man, mid-90s, and we were on exercise. There was an army base on the island then, which is the kind of fact that surprises civilians and bores soldiers, and the unit had been bussed across with all the usual ceremony of soldiers being moved somewhere they don't particularly want to be. We had a piper with us, Scottish regiment this, and on one notable morning during the European Championships, he chose to play Deutschlandlied for Reveille on the day England were due to play Germany. The locals complained. They phoned the base to complain. Actually, phoned the base. Some people you cannot help. But that's not the story. The story is the pool van. I had been into town for the evening. The arrangements for getting back were the standard thing: a clapped-out pool van, a designated driver, and a roster of names who were supposed to climb into it at closing time and be returned to camp in approximately the same condition they'd left in. I'd been drinking, uncharacteristically, even by my own standards. And somewhere in the closing stages of the evening, I'd reached the calm, slightly distant state where my body was still navigating the world quite competently, and the part of me that was supposed to be in charge had taken its coat and gone home. What I remember next is waking up in the back of the van, in motion, with 2 wankers up front. The 2 wankers were Adam and Rupert. I knew this because I could see the back of their heads. The van was otherwise empty, which struck me as wrong, because I had a clear if hazy memory of getting into a van that was full of people. But there was no time to interrogate the discrepancy, because I had a more pressing problem, which was that my bladder had reached the condition I will describe with regimental precision as critical. I considered my options. Option 1 was to lean forward and say, "Lads, pull over, I need a piss." This was the gentleman's option. It was also the option that involved alerting Adam and Rupert to the fact that I was in the van, and at this point I wasn't fully clear on why I was in the van alone with them, or why everyone else seemed to have been disappeared from the manifest, and there was a small calm voice somewhere in the back of my head saying, "Do not draw attention." There had been a previous occasion, on a different exercise, when I'd anticipated a snap PT muster and gone to ground between the mattress and the cot frame, with the sleeping bag arranged on top to look occupied. Adam had come round looking for absentees and had physically poked through the sleeping bag with his hand to confirm it was empty. He had not poked the mattress. He had attempted to report me missing. I have, since that morning, been extremely reluctant to volunteer information to Adam that he is capable of failing to find on his own. Option 2 was to hold it. This was not a viable option, and I will not waste your time pretending it was. Option 3 was the floor of the van. I want to stress that I went into option 3 with full awareness of its disadvantages. I was not so far gone that I thought urinating in a Ministry of Defence vehicle was a normal thing to do. I knew it was not. I simply weighed it, in the moment, against the alternatives, and concluded that the floor of the van was the lesser of 3 available evils. I executed option 3 quietly, efficiently, and with the kind of silent professionalism the regiment had spent a great deal of public money instilling in me. Adam and Rupert did not turn round. This is the part that becomes interesting in retrospect. 2 grown men, in a small enclosed vehicle, did not register that one of their passengers was urinating on the floor approximately 6 feet behind their heads. I can only assume the radio was on, the windows were down, and they were arguing about something. Adam and Rupert argued the way other people breathe. But even so, the absence of any reaction from them to a sound which, in any other social context, would have produced an immediate and pointed inquiry, was remarkable. It told me something about them that I was already inclined to believe. The van pulled into camp. I felt the familiar slowing, the final turn through the gates, the change in road surface as we came onto the parade square. I made a decision. The decision was that under no circumstances was I going to disembark from this van through the side door in front of Adam and Rupert in the same airspace as the puddle I had just deposited on the floor. I needed to be out of the van and into my bunk before they had time to put the situation together. The back door of the van was, by some grace of military procurement, unsecured. What followed was, if I may say so, an excellent piece of work. I exfiltrated through the rear of the vehicle, while Adam and Rupert were still in the front, dismounting at their leisure and discussing whatever it was they were discussing. I crossed the dead ground between the van and the accommodation block at a pace calibrated not to attract attention. I entered the block, climbed into my bunk, removed my boots, closed my eyes, and, to all outward appearances, had been there for the entirety of the evening. I had been there for perhaps 4 minutes when the door of the block banged open and a search party arrived at my bedside. "Where the fuck have you been?" I opened my eyes. Adam was at the foot of the bed. Rupert was behind him. Behind Rupert were 2 or 3 other people whose faces I could not at that moment see clearly, but whose general demeanour suggested they had been doing something tiresome for some hours and had not enjoyed it. "In bed," I said. "You have not been in bed." "I have been in bed for hours," I said. This was a lie of the kind that depends entirely on the conviction of its delivery, and I delivered it with the calm, slightly puzzled patience of a man who cannot understand why his sleep is being disturbed. "What's going on?" "We've been looking for you all night." "Have you?" "All over the fucking island." "Did you check the bed?" This was, the reader may appreciate, a question I asked with a particular interest in the answer. Adam's track record on bed checks was a matter of professional concern to me. There was a pause here which I have always treasured. Adam looked at Rupert. Rupert looked at the bed. The other faces in the doorway looked at the floor or the ceiling or each other, and one of them, I am almost sure, let out a very small breath that, in another setting, would have been a laugh. "We checked the bed." "Did you?" "We checked the bed." "Well," I said, "I've been in it." The argument went on for a little longer than it needed to, but the energy had gone out of it. They had spent the night driving around the island looking for me. They had returned to camp with no me. They had now found me in my bed, which was where I had been all along, or alternatively, where I now claimed to have been all along, and the difference between those two propositions was not something they had the will to litigate at 4 a.m. They left. It was only as I lay there in the dark, listening to them retreat down the corridor, still arguing with each other, that the full architecture of the evening began to assemble itself in my mind. They had not returned to camp with no me. They had returned to camp with me. They had returned to camp with me twice, in fact, because at some point in the evening they must have driven back into town to look for me, with me in the back of the van, and then driven once again to camp, with me still in the back of the van. And on neither leg of that journey had either of them turned round and noticed that the man they were searching for was sitting 4 feet behind them. The fact that I had been asleep for some portion of this is not, in my view, an excuse for them. I am not difficult to see. I am, if anything, larger than average. And then there was the puddle. I lay there and worked it through. They were going to have to return that van to the duty officer. The duty officer was going to ask them how their night had gone. They were going to have to mention, at some point in the conversation, that there was a quantity of urine on the floor of the vehicle. There was no version of this conversation that ended well for them. If they told the truth, "We don't know how it got there, sir," they would be inviting the obvious follow-up question, which was who else had been in the van, and the answer to that question was either nobody, in which case one of them was the pisser, or the man we were looking for, in which case they would have to explain why they had failed to find a man who was sitting in their own vehicle for the duration of the search. Both answers were terminal. There was no third door. I did not sleep particularly well, but I did not sleep particularly badly either. I have always found that the quality of a night's sleep is improved by the knowledge that, somewhere across the camp, 2 specific people are about to have a much worse morning than you are. I never found out what they told the duty officer. I assume, on the balance of probability, that one of them took the hit and confessed to the puddle himself, on the grounds that being the man who pissed in a pool van was a smaller career problem than being one of the 2 men who failed to notice a missing soldier sitting in the back of one. I have wondered occasionally which of them it was. My money is on Rupert. Adam had a stronger sense of self-preservation, but Rupert had a greater sense that he could talk his way out of anything. And the kind of confidence that gets a man through that conversation is exactly the kind of shamelessness that a man who would drop a stolen McNabb book in a puddle was statistically more likely to possess. But it is just as possible they agreed to share the blame, or that the duty officer, faced with 2 men of obviously diminished credibility and a van that smelled the way it smelled, simply signed it off and told them to clean it themselves. Soldiers' problems have a way of resolving themselves quietly when the alternative is paperwork. Some months later, on a different exercise, I found myself in a concealment on a Scottish moor, pretending to be a patch of grass, observing a patrol making its way up the slope towards me as I took potshots. The patrol commander, sweating slightly and visibly out of his depth, came to a halt almost on top of my position, stood with his boots resting, in the most literal sense, on my own. I could feel his weight through the soles, and said, with genuine bewilderment, "That was close. Where the hell are they?" That patrol commander was Rupert. I let him stand on my feet for a few seconds longer than was strictly necessary before taking a further shot. A poet warrior once said that if they could shoot rabbits, then they could shoot fascists. One can only imagine what lexical delights they might have summoned with the knowledge that Rupert's inability to detect a sniper at his feet was reminiscent of his lack of skill at detecting a puddle of pish in a minivan. That, moreover, via some strange synchronicity, was deposited by the very entity he was searching for in both cases. He never did find me. He went away from that ridge convinced the fire had come from somewhere in the trees 50 meters to his left, and so far as I know, he believes it to this day. There is a certain category of man who simply cannot find me. I have made my peace with this. I have, on occasion, made use of it. And on the night of the pool van, on a small army base on an island in the Irish Sea in the summer of an England-Germany match, 2 of them did me the considerable favour of not finding me twice in the same evening, and then again in my own bed. Rupert, on the available evidence, has spent a non-trivial portion of his life in proximity to puddles he did not anticipate. The one in the van was, by my reckoning, the second of his I'd had a hand in. The first was in service of a book he'd had no business taking. The second was in service of a man he'd had no business losing. There is an argument that the universe was simply tidying up after itself. I did not, on either occasion, get my full dignity reinstated. But I did eventually get the bed check question answered. It was not merely a lucky one-off, and on balance, I consider the account closed.